Hi, and welcome to a recorded lecture. This is APUSH History. We're in period 5 of the Civil War, and this is episode 3, The Shots Fired. We have two objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to explain why the Civil War is considered the first modern war. You should be able to describe how a war to preserve the Union eventually became a war to end slavery. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 6. Now, the two sides set off with each other, and they basically have, the North and the South, and each side has some advantages to each end. The Union has a lot of just the practical advantages. They've got the manufacturing, they've got the railroad mileage, and they've got the financial resources that they would need to give them a strong advantage in the war. But to win the war, they had quite a big slate at their hands. They would need to conquer an area larger than Western Europe. Now, Confederate soldiers, on the other hand, were highly motivated fighters. They're fighting for their what they're seeing as their homeland on their turf. And that's a real advantage that the United States would face with the Confederacy. On both sides, the outbreak of war, though, stirred powerful feelings of patriotism, and both sides rallied to the cause. So point B. Railroads were vital to the war effort, particularly in the North, where there were greater railroad infrastructure. So in the North, they've got a more developed railroad, and that's pretty important there. But there's no standard gauge to the trains of this era, and so trains built on one track wouldn't necessarily fit on another track. So they've got the most railroad infrastructure, but there is a severe limitation in how well those trains will work together. I want to talk for a second about a development in shipbuilding known as the ironclads. Now, the ironclads were superior to wooden ships, and they revolutionized naval warfare, and we see it for the first time in the Civil War. The most famous battle of the ironclads was between two ships known as the Monitor and the Merrimac, and it happened in March of 1862. Confederates outfitted the Merrimac. The Merrimac was an old, burned-out U.S. warship, and it was really a pretty outdated piece, but they fitted the Merrimac with these iron rails along the side for... it's actually like railroad rails. And the goal was to go make a battering ram with the ship. So they take an old, burned out wooden ship and they fit it with iron steels, and the whole job is to go smash into the side of another ship. And so the Union Army, countered with their own ironclad ship, this one, the Monitor, which was basically just like a regular ship, but it had steel plates on the side of it. And these two set off in March of 1862, shooting at each other and circling around each other. And it's the first, metal ship battle in the world, and it happens here in the Civil War. And it basically, it's essentially a draw. Neither side could go sink the other side. The Monitor prevented the South from using a new weapon, and that's the most important thing, that while the South was trying to come up with a new weapon, the North was able to counter it pretty easily. And what it really means, and the reason why this is a notable thing, is that it ends the era of wooden ships. The battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac, while they're actually doesn't prove anything on the military field. What it does do is it's a new era in naval combat. The introduction of the rifle was pretty dramatic in the Civil War. The rifle changed the nature of combat. So the guns before this day were what's known as a smooth barrel or a smooth bore. And the barrel of the gun is just a tube. It's just a pipe. And so the bullet, which is a round ball like a slug, would come out of the barrel, and it would really be imprecise. It would be sort of rattling around in the barrel. And by the time it actually came out the gun, it would fly in any direction. It was really unknown where that would come about. But then rifling is a set of grooves on the inside of it that send the bullet ball. When it comes out, it's actually twirling in a circle, and I compare it to like throwing a football in a spiral. It just puts a curve on that bullet as it shoots out of the barrel, and it makes it fly much, much straighter. So the introduction of the rifle changed the nature of combat, that guns can shoot farther and far more accurately than ever had been done before. However, it becomes catastrophic in Civil War because the battle tactics didn't change with the technology. Before this, armies would basically just line up on either side and shoot towards each other, and you could kind of do that in an era of unsure shots and smoothball guns. Because I don't know, you could line up and shoot towards the other one and point right at them and not really have a chance at hitting them. But when you switch to rifles, basically the two armies line up and just mow each other down. And the style of warfare didn't change to meet the changes of technology. Modern warfare also included some new developments like prisoner of war camps, which didn't exist before the Civil War, but that one side would just take the other side as a prisoner rather than outright execution. And of course, all that close encampment also means military disease, which jumps out in a way that people had never seen before. Subpoint C. Both sides were assisted by the vast propaganda effort which was used to mobilize public opinion. Things like lithographs and souvenirs and sheet musics and patriotic organizations, and everybody's trying to stir up emotional appeal on both sides. The war also was brought to people via newspapers and photographs. The photography is an emerging era. It has been around for a little bit in the United States, but it really hits its stride right about the Civil War. And it was a turning point for photography as both an art and a business. This person on the right side of the screen is perhaps one of the greatest photographic artists ever in American history. And his name is Matthew Brady. And he's America's first great photojournalist. Moving onto the battlefields and going taking pictures of the action. His photos would be reported back. They'd be run in newspapers. They would be reprinted and circulated around, and brings the battlefield in its reality to the home. You're not getting romanticized paintings of it. You're actually seeing the battlefields as they are. The sad thing about Matthew Brady is that while his photos are magnificent, I mean, Matthew Brady was so good. The technology for his day was, I mean, he was a master of it. One of the problems is, though, is that after the Civil War, everybody was so eager to just put the war behind them and to move on that a lot of his stuff was destroyed. And sadly, we don't have a huge record of it. It's a real shame. So point D. The outbreak of the war found both sides ultimately unprepared. They had undeveloped railroads and small and inefficient navies. They had undersized Union supply lines, and both sides really weren't prepared to go to war. The feeding and supplying of the armies would be a challenge for both sides. Now, in the North, they have more resources at their hand to go master this problem, and eventually the North would be the best fed and best equipped military in all of military history ever. They would be the best at it, but the truth is that the South fought on the brink of starvation. The two economies growing up so differently that the North has a diversified economy with great infrastructure, and the South makes all its money on a product you can't eat, turned into a real problem for the South. Despite the North's advantages, though, they had a hard time turning those advantages into battlefield successes. And I think why we can turn to subpoint E. The Confederacy adopted a defensive strategy. The Confederacy knew that even though that they were the side that was seceding, they ultimately didn't have to win. They just had to not lose. And so it was really you could fight this battle defensively as a war of attrition. It didn't needed to immediately invade the North. There was really no advantage for the South to go invade the North. It just had to defend its own territory. Lincoln's early generals also didn't successfully use the North's advantages. The North had advantages in manpower and in technology, and they just really had a hard time turning those into battlefield successes. And Lincoln also had a hard time finding competent generals. In a cruel tryst of fate, all of the best military schools were in the South, and so all of the Confederate generals that would have been great, Union generals, all had their loyalties in the South. So kind of a sad deal for the North that they really had a crisis of leadership for a long time. Lincoln realized that his armies had to defeat the Confederate armies. They had to do two things. They had to go beat the side that was seceding, but also had to dismantle slavery. And that's a tall task for anybody, especially if they don't have good military leadership. Subpoint F. So the first shots happen in South Carolina at the Battle of Fort Sumter, but the first really battles that we talk about, the first battle begins in the East, and most of the war's fighting takes place in a narrow 100-mile corridor between Washington and Richmond, and it's right along the Potomac River. And the North assembles a fighting force there known as the Army of the Potomac. Lost my place on the page. In the first battle of Bull Run, so it's the first real great battle. It's the first battle of Bull Run. The South refers to it as the Battle of Manassas Creek. It's the same battle. There's two names for it: the Battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Manassas Creek. And it was a Confederate victory. And it right away shatters the idea that war was going to be romantic or something noble and chivalrous. In July of 1861, General P.T.G. Beauregard, his Confederate troops routed the Union troops. And after the first Battle of Bull Run, George McClellan, who's leading the Army of the Potomac, George McClellan took command of the Army of the Potomac and enlisted another 1,000,000 troops. Now, at the time, there's no position that's known as like the commander of all the Union forces, but the first one we can really point at is General McClellan, because he's leading an incredibly large fighting force camped along the Potomac River in the Army of the Potomac. In 1862, McClellan launched a thrust towards Richmond, Virginia. Now, Richmond's the Confederate capital, but he ultimately moved too slowly. He didn't mobilize the troops fast enough. And part of this is because he has an enormous army, and it's just hard to get him moving all at the same time. And part of it was because he's just seems really reluctant to move. General Robert E. Lee launched a counterattack outside of Richmond, and there Lee suffered heavy casualties. But ultimately, McClellan couldn't exploit the advantage of the lopsided numbers, and Richmond remained secure. So they go and attack on Richmond, and the South is able to repel them, even at the cost of huge lives. General Lee then blunted McClellan's attacks throughout the rest of Virginia and forced him to withdraw back to the vicinity of Washington, D.C. Now, General Robert E. Lee was successful on the defensive then. He was able to keep the North from invading into the South, so he then launched an invasion of the North to go push back the troops further back. And so McClellan's army at the Army of the Potomac stopped Lee at the Battle of Antietam, which was in Maryland. And the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862, remains, even to this day, remains the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. There was 7,650 casualties, and both sides are Americans. Jackson and Lee routed a Union army at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, and Jackson's troops arrived just in time to go save Lee's troops from total defeat. Now, Lincoln ended up replacing McClellan. He fired McClellan and replaced him with Ambrose Burnside. And Burnside was also a real mess. He led a disastrous assault on, we're way out of synchronous here. Sorry. I get so excited just working ahead of myself. Lincoln replaced McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, and Burnside left a disastrous assault on Lee at Fredericksburg in Virginia, which resulted in a disastrous Union defeat in December of 1862. So then Burnside was reassigned, he resigned, he was forced to step down, and was replaced by Joe Hooker, which is known as Fightin' Joe, and he's the next army from the North. So just as kind of a go through, in a real short period of time, you had George McClellan leading the Army of the Potomac, and then he can't go and fight Lee. He gets pushed back by Lee, so they fire McClellan, and then they replace him with Burnside, and Burnside ultimately can't get anywhere either, so they fire Burnside and replaced with Joe Hooker, which brings us to subpoint H. Ulysses S. Grant was the architect of success in the West. So Grant isn't fighting where everybody else is in the Potomac. He's on the western side of the war. In February of 1862, Ulysses S. Grant won the Union's first significant victory. So the first time they actually chalk up an important win was Ulysses S. Grant, and he does it at when he captures Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee. Now, in April of that year, in 1862, a Confederate army caught Grant by surprise near Shiloh in Tennessee, and basically ends up starting to capture Union troops. Grant forced a Confederate withdrawal, but at a pretty significant cost of casualties. Roman numeral number 7. At the outset of the war, Lincoln invoked a time-honored Northern values to mobilize public support. He referred to the American democracy as the whole family of man. Still, Lincoln initially insisted that slavery was irrelevant to the conflict. Lincoln's the stuff that kind of dogs Lincoln is that he doesn't come out as a strong abolitionist in the early days, and I think we actually see some of the. If we can justify this for a moment, the grounds we would justify it on is that Lincoln knows that if he wants to go through and abolish slavery, that it's politically very impossible and probably tactically impossible to do so. And just as a good, I think the best generals and the best presidents know that they don't pick fights they can't win. So Lincoln initially insisted that slavery was irrelevant to the conflict. And he knows that if he goes and declares slavery to be illegal, one, it would be truly beyond the scope of what the president can legally do. And he also sees that 4 border states, Missouri, Maryland, Kentucky, and Delaware, which are slaveholding states, if he just goes and outlaws slavery, then they're actually likely to split from the Union with everybody else. And he wanted to keep them from seceding. He also tried to build broad support in the North. And if he abolishes slavery, he would jeopardize both goals. We would lose more states, and he would lose the support in the North to do so. Subpoint B. What actually ends up trying to unravel slavery is the work of several people besides Lincoln. So early in the war, Congress adopted a resolution proposed by Crittenden of Kentucky, whom we met in our last class. And Crittenden affirmed that the Union had no intention of interfering with slavery. He says that, all in all, this isn't what the Union's going to be doing. The policy of ignoring slavery, though, ultimately unraveled. And by the end of 1861, the military began treating escaped black people as contraband of war. So this is a tricky position in 1861. The North looks at slaves and they say, we don't believe that slaves are property, but the South believes they are property. So if you have an escaped slave and they come up to the North, legally, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, they need to be returned to the South unless they have military value as property, which they're not property. But if they are property, then they would have military value, which means they didn't have to return to the South. So the North walks kind of a legal line on this one, but the process of ignoring slavery, by 1861, the military began treating escaped black people as contraband of war. And they're not like refugees. They're being held as property, and black people considered the conflict a freedom war, and I think with fair reasoning. Subpoint C. Since slavery stood at the foundation of the Southern economy, anti-slavery Northerners insisted that emancipation was necessary to weaken the South's ability to sustain the war. The argument goes that if we're fighting the South and we have any legal ability to go weaken them to do so by liberating the slaves, then we have a military reason we should do it. And throughout 1861 and 1862, Lincoln really struggled to stay in control of this entire emancipation issue. And I think maybe one of the best examples of this is our old friend, Union General John C. Fremont. So Fremont, whom we met in the Bear Flag Rebellion earlier, John C. Fremont, when he was in Missouri, when he took the Union forces into Missouri, issued a military order freeing the slaves there. I think this is a great moment of emancipation when Fremont issues the order freeing the slaves in Missouri in August of 1861. However, Lincoln says that while there is a military advantage to it, it's also, jeopardizes the goals of keeping Missouri in the Union. And so Lincoln reverses the order. He rescinds Fremont's order, effectively re-enslaving free people. Lincoln proposed for gradual emancipation and colonization for border slave states. The gradual emancipation, not an order of Fremont. That's again, if we have to bag on Lincoln, and I don't like doing this. Lincoln's one of my favorite presidents. I think we can say that when he re-enslaves people that are free, that's a serious mark against him. But it also seems to be somewhat justifiable considering his larger goals. It's hard to justify slavery, but from a tactical position, I understand what he's doing. Subpoint D. During the summer of 1862, Lincoln concluded, though, that emancipation had become a necessity, both politically and militarily. But he knew that if he announces the Emancipation Proclamation, and he does it at a time when the Union is losing the war, then it looks like a desperate bid. He basically has to wait for the Union to get some important wins before he can issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And what happens is it's the Battle of Antietam that does it. It's the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, Emancipation Proclamation, I don't think a lot of people really get what it was. It was a fairly narrow lane. It only applied to slaves in Confederate-held territory. Those would be free. So it wasn't full emancipation. It actually applied to just very few people. So because it's a military order, let me step this back. The Emancipation Proclamation is an order that comes by authority of the president as commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. So he's not issuing it as president of the United States. He's not issuing it as the policymaker for the country. He's issuing the Emancipation Proclamation as Commander-in-Chief, which means it only applies to Confederate states which seceded but are under the control of the Union Army, so recaptured, occupied states. If a state didn't secede, then the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply there. Or, so like there's a few Union states that have slavery and it's legal. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free those slaves. And if they're Confederate states, which has not been recaptured by the North, then one, obviously they're not going to pay any attention to it. But two, that would be beyond his scope as Commander-in-Chief. So the Emancipation Proclamation is an important document, but it's actually fairly narrow in who it actually affects in the time. So, but despite its limitations, it's the beginning of the end of slavery, and the proclamation set off scenes of jubilation among free black people and abolitionists in the North, as well as contrabands and slaves in the South. Subpoint E. Of the Emancipation Proclamation, of its provisions, few were more radical in their implication than the enrollment of black people into military service. It allows free slaves to go join the Union Army and to do so legally. And that's actually a pretty huge deal because this is free black people holding guns and fighting in battle. And that was almost unheard of. By the end of the war, there was over 180 black men serving in the Union Army and 24,000 black men serving in the Navy. For black soldiers, we're talking about the Army, the military service proved to be a liberating experience. There was at least 130 former soldiers who, in the years after the Civil War, ran for office, and part of their political credibility was that they had served in the Civil War. The Union Navy. The Union Navy has a tremendous amount of parity between black and white soldiers, and I think there's something about being on the boat that nobody gets away. They're all in the same place together, right? The Union Navy treated black soldiers basically the same as white sailors. That black sailors, white sailors had pretty much equal treatment to them. The Army, not so much. Within the Army, black soldiers didn't receive equal treatment to white soldiers. Black soldiers, though, played a crucial role not only in winning the Civil War, but also in defining the war's consequences. We're hitting this stuff really fast. We're running through the Civil War pretty quickly. Lean into your textbook on this one. It's Dr. Foner at his best. This is his specialty as a historian, is specifically Civil War history, so enjoy it. Make sure you're reading the text pretty carefully. Thanks. Make sure to like and subscribe.